Fabiano Caruana starts the game with the move e4. Nakamura responds with e5, and this is the finals of the winner's bracket in American Chess Cup 2025. Top two American chess players clash against each other. First two games with classical time control ended in a draw, and now we have blitz games to determine the winner of the match. Caruana continues with knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6. We have two knights defense, slow variation, classical variation with the move d3. Nakamura plays bishop e7, knight c3, d6, a3 to control the square b4, castle for black, bishop develops to e3, bishop goes to e6 for Nakamura, and Caruana hops the knight to a square d5. The first unusual move comes here. Nakamura plays queen c8. Not exactly a theoretical move, although, of course, it exists. Bishop goes to b3, and now another unusual move, bishop d8. But Nakamura has a plan. He is opening the square e7 for the knight. We'll see the plan very soon. Castle for Caruana, bishop takes d5. That knight on d5 was too strong to keep it there. Pawn takes d5, and knight goes back to e7. And now both knights are attacking the pawn on d5. It has to be protected, and Caruana plays c4. And knight jumps to f5, hitting the bishop on e3. Bishop moves back to d2, and now c6, challenging white center. Exchange of the pawns on c6. Now here normally black would take with the pawn, but as Nakamura said after the game, he didn't like the next move for white, c5. c5, and then challenging the black pawn on d6, and then let's say if d takes c5, then knight takes e5. And he didn't like that position, he didn't want to go into those variations, and therefore he grabbed the pawn with the queen. Caruana plays rook c1 and bishop d6. From a sad-looking bishop on e7, now, after removing it to d8 and b6, now this bishop is absolutely looking fine on this nice diagonal. Bishop a4 attacking the queen, queen moves back, b4, and now the threat is c5, trapping the black bishop, and therefore a5, challenging the pawn on b4. Things starting to get interesting here. Bishop g5. And Nakamura takes the pawn on b4. He is not afraid to open up his king, because after bishop takes f6, and that's what Caruana played, g takes f6, it seems like the king is not safe. But apparently, white do not have any pieces to attack it. And the g file actually will work in favor of black. c5. You might ask here, and that would be a very legitimate question, why not take the pawn on b4, a takes b4? Because that would normal person would do. Apparently, there is an absolutely brilliant tactical move here that both players actually saw during the game, knight e3, forking the queen and the rook. And if white takes the knight with the pawn, bishop takes e3 check, king h1, bishop takes the rook on c1, queen takes c1, and the bishop on a4 is hanging. And this is winning for black. Both players saw that combination, and therefore Caruana didn't take the pawn on b4, but instead played c5 and sacrificed the pawn. d takes c5, a takes b. Now you cannot take back because you're going to lose the queen. The pawn is pinned, queen d6, removing the queen from the pin. b5. As Nakamura said after the game, this move he didn't like at all for Caruana, because this move blocks the bishop, and now it's really becoming a very, very sad piece on a square a4. Rook d8, and that's attacking the pawn on d3. White decided that there is no good way to defend this pawn, and sacrificed the pawn with the move knight d2. And Caruana played knight d4. He said that he didn't like the move queen takes d3 because of bishop c2. He has to go back to d7 to protect the knight on f5, and then moves like knight c4 or knight e4. Caruana will have a very big initiative for 2 sacrifice pawns, and he just didn't want to go into that position. And played knight d4. After the game, Nakamura said that this is the best move he made in the whole tournament. Knight c4, attacking the queen and the bishop. Queen goes to e6, and rook e1. White doesn't want to take the bishop on b6 because that bishop is not that good. Looking at its own pieces, and knight on c4 is a very nice outpost for the knight there, and the knight looks great on this square c4. Bishop c7, rook e3, transferring the rook on a g file, possibly attacking the black king. Nakamura preemptively goes to h8, and Caruana does the same with move king h1. Nakamura said after the game that in this position, he thought that Caruana, and he was actually afraid that Caruana will play the move b6. And that was probably the best move in the position to open up this sad-looking bishop on a4. As soon as Caruana didn't play that, Nakamura immediately played b6 himself to block any attempts in the future to play b6 for white. Rook h3, rook g8, queen h5. Looks dangerous. There is a checkmate on h7 lurking, but a simple move queen f5 protects from everything and actually makes white to exchange the queens, and that's what happens on the square f5. Bishop goes to d1 to somehow activate that bishop on a square f3, but Nakamura doesn't allow it by going back to d4 with the knight and controlling not only the square f3, but also a pawn on b5 is hanging right now. Rook b1 to protect that pawn, but that's too passive, and Nakamura's advantage is becoming crucial. Rook a2, getting into the second rank, attacking the pawn on f2, king g1 to protect that pawn, doubling up the rook on the a file, king f1, exchanging the rooks on the a1 square, and now the bishop on d1 is pinned, and look at this knight, absolute monster on a square d4. The king from f1 cannot even unpin himself and go to e2. It has to go to e1 to protect the bishop on d1, and the bishop is still pinned. And Nakamura just takes the pawn on b5, and now has 2 extra pawns and absolutely winning position. King d2, knight goes back to d4, rook h6, to create some counter chances to attack the pawn on f6, but here comes a simple combination, b5 attacking the knight, knight has to go back, bishop a5 check, and believe it or not, in this position, white has only one legal move, and that's king e3, and after knight f5, there is a fork, winning the rook on h6. Caruana resigned, Nakamura is leading the match 1-0. Game number 2, Caruana playing black, Nakamura playing white starts with e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, Sicilian defense, a6, Najdorf variation. One of the most aggressive openings for black, and it's no surprise because Caruana must win this game in order to continue with the match. So he chose a very aggressive Najdorf variation where the game is going for all 3 results. a4, b6, bishop develops to e2, bishop b7 attacking the pawn on e4, bishop f3 protecting that pawn, knight develops to d7, and knight jumps to a central square d5. After e5, Nakamura said after the game he didn't like this position at all for white and decided not to go with the basic variation of removing the knight from the attack to b3, but decided to sacrifice the pawn. He took the knight on f6, knight takes f6, and jumps with the knight on a square f5 and gave up a pawn on e4, and he thought that would be better for him, especially in a blitz game. Castle, queen d7, attacking the knight on f5, knight goes back to e3, and d5. And now black have very nice central pawns, d5, e5, very active position, and an extra pawn. c4 immediately challenging black center, d4 attacking the knight, knight goes to d5, bishop takes d5, c takes d5. Now black cannot take the pawn on d5 with the queen, because this is a deadly pin, and the knight will eventually get lost. Knight goes to f6, and now there are two attackers on the pawn on d5. Nakamura counterattacks with rook e1, challenging the pawn on e5. Bishop d6 not only develops the bishop, but protects the pawn on e5. Nakamura plays bishop f4, attacking the pawn on e5 using the pin. You cannot take the bishop with the pawn because the king would be under attack. Therefore, queen e7, but still bishop takes e5. Because after bishop takes c5, Nakamura has a nice tactical shot, d6, attacking the queen on e7 and the rook on a8. Queen is more important, and queen takes d6, bishop takes a8, castle. So what we have in this position, white, Nakamura, has an extra exchange, a rook for the knight, but black have 6 pawns versus 5, and the pawn on d4 is the passing pawn, very, very important in this game. And that pawn actually gives black the chances to not only survive this game, but also play for the win. Bishop f3, d3. And here, after the game, Nakamura said that from a practical standpoint, considering that he had minute 42 on the clock and Caruana only had 38 seconds, and the draw was in his favor, and Caruana had to win this game, all he had to do just to sacrifice the exchange back. Rook takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes d3, simplify the position, then eventually capture the pawns A and B, and that would be a very easy draw. And this is what he had to do, according to Nakamura himself, but instead he played rook e3, attacking the pawn on d3, rook d8 protected that pawn, and attacked that pawn from a different direction, from the move rook a3. But now d2, and this pawn is becoming a real thorn in white's position. And Nakamura makes a mistake. He plays the move rook d3, allowing black to sacrifice the queen. Obviously, it's a symbolic sacrifice because you're sacrificing the queen for 2 rooks, which is not really an advantage for white. So now, in this position, Caruana has a rook and a knight for the queen. But again, the most important part of the position is the pawn on d2. And now the question is, how do you promote that pawn? Because white are gonna prevent it with the bishop and the queen. Both the bishop and the queen will always be protecting the square d1 from this pawn being promoted. Caruana must win. So the game continues with a series of moves, shuffling pieces around, and I'll go quickly here because not much would be happening. Caruana is trying his best to create some possibilities of promoting this pawn, and most importantly, he is trying for Nakamura to make a mistake. So he is moving the knights around, he is attacking the queen, he moves his pieces around, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop, Nakamura just standing still, and finally Nakamura makes a mistake and plays the queen on a square e2. And in this position, black could win, and if you find a move with which Caruana was winning this position, then I guess you are better than Nakamura and better than Caruana, because Nakamura couldn't find that move without an engine even after the game. And it came to a big surprise to him, the move that's winning for black. And the move that's winning for black, believe it or not, King F8. You're asking, what? Why? Turns out that white doesn't have moves. White does not have any good moves. The queen cannot leave the bishop unprotected because the rook will capture that bishop. And let's say if queen f3, which seems to be like the only move because it still protects the bishop, then knight d4, attacking the queen. And let's say queen a8 check, simply king g7. And there is no way for the queen to return to protect that bishop. And the bishop is gonna be captured. And black would win the game. So king f8 was the winning move. Let's go back to this position. Impossible to find with 21 seconds for a human. Bishop c3, not a bad move, and this position is still already winning for Caruana. Bishop b3 was another huge mistake, and the winning move for black here was much easier to find, knight d4, forking the queen and the bishop. And let's say queen e5 check, king h7, no more checks. Here is another great variation, bishop f7, takes f7. And believe it or not, if Caruana promotes to a queen, seemingly winning the game on the spot, after an incredible move, bishop g8, king takes g8, and now white has a queen against the queen, rook, bishop, and knight. And this is a draw. And the reason it's a draw, because the black cannot escape a perpetual check. So check, another check. There is no way to escape the checks, and the game would end in a perpetual check, in a draw. Now, in this position, instead of promoting the pawn to the queen, the winning move was sacrificing the rook on g1, believe it or not. Rook g1 check. And then after king takes g1, then you can promote with the check and win that way. Very complicated variations. Neither player really saw this, during the game at least. And after a series moves, a rook e1, attacking the queen, queen goes to d3, bishop b4. This position is better for black, again, because of this pawn, but it's very, very difficult to win this. Again, Caruana is trying, many more moves are made. I'll go quickly here. Queen d3 is a mistake, but nothing crucial here, nothing really dramatically changes in the evaluation of the position. Rook e1, again, the promotion square on d1 is thoroughly protected by white pieces. More moves are made. Rook goes to e1, queen goes to f3. It feels like we already had this position before. And another mistake by Nakamura, bishop c2. And again, black could win this game. And Caruana finds the first move, rook c1. Bishop goes back to d1, and here Caruana had to find another incredible move, sacrificing the rook on d1. Rook takes d1, queen takes d1, and after knight d3, again it turns out that white queen does not have any moves. And let's say if it goes queen b1, then simply knight b2, and queen cannot take on b2 because there would be a queen on d1, and if white do nothing, there's still going to be a queen on d1 because the knight is protecting the promotion square on d1. Another incredible variation that Caruana didn't find in 8 seconds. Instead, he played king g7, queen e2, knight d3. Now, just to make sure, knight d3, you cannot take it, because again, after queen takes d3, rook takes d1, and this position would be already lost for white. Nakamura plays bishop b3, check from e1. Caruana is still trying to find some ways to promote the pawn and create some issues for Nakamura, but unfortunately, in this particular position, after knight e1, unfortunately for Caruana, there is a great move, queen d4. And what's happening now? Now black do not have any moves. King cannot go back because the rook would be under attack. The rook cannot move because it's pinned. And the bishop has to protect this pawn, and the knight does not have any moves. It cannot go to f3 because it's not protected by the rook, because the rook is pinned. The rook cannot capture the bishop. The rook is pinned. Incredible ending of this game. This particular position is totally winning for Nakamura, but let's remember, he only needs a draw. And after bishop e7, he took the pawn on d2, bishop b4, he returned to d4, bishop went back to e7. Again, black do not have any more moves. And Nakamura could continue to play this for a win, playing, let's say, f4, but he decided to be pragmatic in this case. The draw was in his favor, and he just repeated the moves. And after this repetition, the players agreed to a draw, which means that Nakamura won the match 1.5 to 2.5 to 1.5, and advanced to a grand final. And in the grand final, his opponent would be the winner of the match between Fabiano Caruana and Levon Aronian. If you like this video, please subscribe. I would really appreciate that. And any comments would be appreciated and answered immediately. Thank you for watching.